counter-cyclical because it will help the economy move back to potential output. A fiscal contraction is pro-cyclical during a recession because it is moving with the cycle. During a recession, the economy is going down. If the budget is expanding, it's moving against the cycle. In a recession, if the budget is pulling the economy down, it is moving in the same direction as the cycle. And similarly, this is again a very familiar identity. We've seen it many, many times. If government spending increases, it contributes to GDP, but there is an impact on consumption through the multiplier effect. That is positive. But when the government spends and it borrows in financial markets from the banking system, it can crowd out private investment. So the impact of an initial G on consumption is supposed to be positive, but may be negative on investment. If the government spends more and it increases imports, the M is going to go up, it will have a negative impact on GDP. If the government spends today and it raises the level of public debt and keeps doing that, then what will happen? If people see that happening, the point here is that it raises questions about whether the fiscal position is sustainable. If the fiscal position is not sustainable, it creates a lot of uncertainty. If there's a lot of uncertainty, people would rather save more than consume more. There could be a negative impact on GDP. Another channel that you might have heard about is Ricardian equivalence. If the government is spending today, it is running a fiscal deficit, and the level of the budget is increasing, it will have to raise taxes tomorrow. If that is happening and people feel that taxes will be raised tomorrow, they might reduce their consumption today to save, to pay for taxes. That's the idea of Ricardian. What is the impact of this government spending on the economy? Well, all of the impact does not take place in 1 year. We know that people make decisions about this period, next period, and next period after that, because all of us are infinitely lived consumers, infinitely lived representative agents. The bottom line is we make intertemporal decisions. We don't live forever, but we make intertemporal decisions. So some of the impact on output takes place in the current time period, but some of the impact might take place in the future time periods as well. So there is an impact multiplier. So if you look at your impulse response function and you have a government spending shock, the impulse response function typically looks like that. There's an impact immediately, but the impact continues during the different time periods, and there is a peak multiplier, usually after the initial period, or it could be, so your impulse response function, if this is time, and this is the impact on output. Of a government spending shock, you may have an impulse response function that looks like this. In that case, this is your impact multiplier. Right? This is your peak multiplier. Right? So the government spending has an immediate impact. That impact may increase over time and then finally go down. Or you may have an impulse response function that sort of can look like this as well. So your impact multiplier, the peak multiplier, same as this. What determines the size of this multiplier? What determines the shape of this impulse response function? Well, first of all, where the economy is in the business cycle. Why is that? If you are in a boom kind of a situation and the government spends a lot, the economy is already producing at full employment, and if the government adds more spending, there might be supply and capacity constraints. So the impact of government spending may not be that large, or actually may be negative as well, because what is government spending may lead to an equal or more fall in private investment. But if the economy is operating in a recession, there is a lot of spare capacity. And if there's a lot of spare capacity, the government spending does not have much, may not impact prices and wages that much. And all of the impact of the government spending shows in terms of larger quantities rather than in higher prices and wages. So the state of the business cycle may have an impact on the size of the multiplier and even the direction of the multiplier. If the government is spending, so fiscal policy is expansionary, but monetary policy is getting tightened, then the impact of the multiplier will be smaller. Right? Because what is being done by fiscal policy is being offset by monetary policy. So you have a smaller fiscal multiplier. At the same time, if you don't have a very good monetary transmission mechanism, then you can have a larger multiplier. Why? Because the fiscal spending will not necessarily lead to an increase in interest rates. So the crowding out that we talked about of the private sector might not be as large. And this was the simple, standard Keynesian rationale for fiscal multipliers and for fiscal policy. The economy is stuck at the level of the interest rate, and all of the impact of fiscal spending will show up in terms of higher output. The composition of fiscal adjustment makes a difference. You remember that tax multipliers are different from fiscal expenditure multipliers. Typically, expenditure multipliers are higher than tax multipliers. So if you reduce your taxes by a certain amount, the impact of that, so you might get the same budget deficit, but the impact on the economy will be different. And finally, the whole idea that fiscal multipliers may be, because people are looking across time periods. If they see government spending going up today, if they feel that that will lead to higher government taxes tomorrow, they may not spend more today, and therefore the multiplier will not be high or might actually be zero. The other things that can affect the size of the multiplier, if you have a closed economy, all of the government spending will create demand domestically. But if it's an open economy and the government spends a part of that expenditure on buying imported, let's say computers from somewhere else, machinery from somewhere else, then that is will affect the size of the increase in output. If the private sector, if the government spends, that creates incomes of the private sector. If the private sector has a high propensity to import, then the leakage from the economy will be higher and you will have a smaller multiplier. Labor market rigidities, once again, if wages and prices do not adjust quickly, then it can lead to a larger fiscal money. Exchange rate regime. Countries with a fixed exchange rate regime tend to have larger multipliers because the prices, the exchange rate does not move. You see all of the movement in terms of quantities rather than in terms of prices. How big are these multipliers across different countries? Well, Japan seems to have a large fiscal multiplier. And this is from a time period when Japan is stuck essentially in a recession. Okay. It also has a situation which very much looks like a liquidity trap. And the other countries seem to have smaller multipliers. And once again, the multipliers are different for public investment and other sorts of government investment. You want your fiscal policy to be counter-cyclical. If the economy is in a recession, you want the economy to be supported by fiscal policy. So you want expansion of fiscal policy when the economy is contracting. And counter-cyclical. So this is a chart which is saying that fiscal policy makes mistakes, but increasingly you're finding that over this time period, over a later time period, you have a fiscal policy that is sort of doing the right thing in these economies. This is a chart that is relating the change in the cyclically adjusted balance. So that is what is the change in the fiscally adjusted balance? That's just your fiscal impulse. And it's relating it to the output gap. And you seem to have a situation where in some countries, and most of the countries, where the output gap is negative, you are getting a situation where the budget is counter-cyclical. That means it is trying to help the economy, but the economy is down, and it's trying to slow down the economy, and the economy is running too hot. Finally, what did we learn as part of this session? First of all, that there is a range of fiscal indicators that can be constructed to assess the fiscal policy. We have overall balance. We can also think about primary balance, current balance. Right? All of those measures can be set up. We need to adjust the fiscal balances for the business cycle, in particular, and other factors, one-off factors and structural factors, to get an idea of what really government actions are doing that are in their own hands and that are not dictated by some external shocks or by one-off things that cannot be done again and again. And once we make those adjustments, we can figure out what the fiscal stance is, and we can figure out what the fiscal impulse is. And once we know the fiscal stance and the fiscal impulse, we can then say whether a fiscal policy is counter-cyclical or pro-cyclical. We want fiscal policy to be counter-cyclical, so when the output gap is negative, we want fiscal policy to be expansionary, the fiscal impulse to be positive, and vice versa. If the economy is heating up, we want the fiscal stance to be counter-cyclical, which means it should slow down the economy and not heat up the economy even more. We can calculate these cyclically adjusted balances either using an aggregated approach, looking at total revenues and expenditures, and if we have data on different revenue categories and we have some elasticities for those particular revenue categories, then we can make the adjustment on a disaggregated basis. Revenue category by revenue category, expenditure category by expenditure category. Then we add all of them up to once again calculate the cyclically adjusted balance, calculate the fiscal incomes, right? And the fiscal stance and the fiscal incomes. Finally, fiscal multipliers measure the impact of government actions on the economy, on output, and the size of fiscal multipliers depends upon a number of factors. And we looked at many of those factors as part of the discussion. Let's stop here. What's that? Let's take a look at the Excel file very quickly. Then I'll stay back for you if you have some questions about your project. For your exam, there will be all multiple choice questions. You're given a statement, you choose A, B, C, or D, but you must choose one of them. So it will be all multiple choice. I think it's going to be about 1 hour, 60 minutes is the standard time. So no essay type questions, no long answer questions, just A, B, C, D. Open book or closed book? That's what you're asking. What is it usually? Is it open book or closed book? It's closed book, right? Let me talk about that. I don't have a problem with it. I think open book exams are perfectly fine. I mean, if you understand the concepts, then you should be, and if there's some calculation, unless you do it the right way. But let me talk to Dr. I like it very much, but I need to talk to Dr. Ha. And if he says it's okay, it's okay. I mean, this is you just need to pass the course. It's not like you have to get a big grade. And I'm sure everybody will pass the course. 60% of your grade is in a presentation, which will be fantastic. So you're already way ahead. But let me talk to Dr. I will also give you some examples of the multiple choice questions, and I will put it up on Moodle so you have some idea of what multiple choice questions will look like. I can't give you the whole exam, but I will give you some examples of multiple choice questions. So let's open the final Excel file, and I think in this file maybe all the answers are already there. So you might not have to do very much. Well, not all the answers. Okay, so the fiscal file is very simple. Here on the first sheet, this is something that I've shown you before. This is the fiscal accounts of the government of Vietnam. This was a part of the macro file as well. Here are the revenues of the government, which are taken from the fiscal file. This sheet seems to have all the information. So we have the breakdown of revenues into the different categories. We have tax revenues, which are the largest portion of revenues for Vietnam. We have non-tax revenues, and finally, we have grants from foreign governments that come into Vietnam. We have the expenditures of the government, and we've divided them into, as I said, current non-interest and interest expenditures. And then the government net acquisition of non-financial assets is capital expenditure. We can express all of those as a percentage of GDP. get a graph that looks like this, which breaks down government expenditures into current spending, which is current non-interest spending, interest spending, and capital spending. Nothing big here. We then have the budget deficit, where we can calculate different fiscal indicators. In particular, we have the overall balance, which is just revenues minus expenditures. So 21.5 minus 23.6 is 2.2. Okay. If we take revenues and minus only current, non-interest, and capital spending, right, we will get minus 1.2, because we are adding back this into this. So minus 2.2 plus 0.9 is 1.2, rounding, right? Or minus 0.8 plus 0.8 is equal to 0. Primary balance. This gives us a picture of what has been happening to revenues and expenditures, what has been happening to different indicators of the fiscal balance. You might have an overall deficit, but you can have a primary surplus. And down here below, we have the path of public debt for Vietnam, which was increasing up to 2016, but then has been falling since then, and Vietnam has a pretty good public debt situation. So here is where we need to put in some formulas, okay, because we have the chart, but it's not quite doing what we needed to do. In particular, notice that these two columns are exactly the same. So the primary, particularly primary balance and the fiscal stance are just the negative numbers, but this needs a correction. You cannot have a primary balance of minus 22% of GDP, so something is missing. So let's go back to this sheet here, which is the BC aggregated. And we need to put in the formula for the cyclically adjusted revenues. And let me see if it does the right thing. But it seems to do the right thing. And what has it done? It has taken the overall revenue, right? Made an adjustment to it for the cycle by using the actual Y and the Y star. So the number, which was 588, which is the actual revenue, and what is the situation here? Here potential output is less than actual output, so the economy is in a recession. So it should adjust, the cyclically adjusted revenue should be higher than actual, I think. And it is. Right? Actual revenue is 588.4. Sorry, it has to be adjusted the other way around. Right? So actual revenue is too high because the economy is in a boom. If you adjust it by the cycle, the actual revenue should be lower than that number 588.4, and we get a number like 587.6, which is the correct direction of adjustment. We can copy that formula now all the way, and our sheet is pretty much filled, I think. And notice that we have a series for the primary balance as a percentage of GDP, and we have cyclically adjusted primary balance as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of potential output, remember, and we have the overall balance as a percentage of GDP, and we have a cyclically adjusted overall balance as a percentage of potential GDP. Notice that here the overall balance is positive as a percentage of GDP, which means that there is a surplus. If you were to just look at this number, what would you say? The budget is taking out of the economy because it's running a surplus. But if you make the adjustment for the cycle, the cyclically adjusted overall balance is a deficit, and from this you will reach the conclusion that the budget is pushing into the economy. Okay? And here the size of the push, the direction is the same, but the size of the push is different. Here the adjustment is not very large, which is probably telling you that the economy is pretty much, the output gaps are very small. So Y star and Y are probably very close, so the adjustment to revenues is not very large. Here the output gap might be large, therefore the adjustment to the revenues might be quite large, and that's why you're getting a different number. And once you do that, you can calculate the fiscal stance. If this is the cyclically adjusted primary balance, the minus of the cyclically adjusted primary balance is the fiscal stance. Positive number means what? It means that something is getting pushed into the economy, there is a deficit, and you can also calculate the fiscal impulse, which is just the difference between the fiscal stance here and here. So 0.13 minus 1.28 will be this number. And from here, once again, you can draw a chart of the fiscal impulse and the primary balance, the cyclically adjusted primary balance. And it even gives you the conclusion about when fiscal policy is tighter, less expansionary, more contractionary, when the fiscal impulse is negative. So these are the time periods where fiscal impulse was negative. These are the time periods, these are the years in which fiscal impulse was positive. And when fiscal impulse is positive, we know that fiscal policy is becoming more expansionary or less contractionary. You should be able to get a lot of the data for your countries from the World Economic Outlook for the fiscal side, because there is general government revenue, general government expenditures. The interest payments might be a little bit more complicated to get, but for your countries, they're all advanced countries, you should be able to find it. As soon as you put in that data in here, you will have an answer for what years the fiscal stance in your country was, when was fiscal policy established, when was fiscal policy. And the final sheet is just again the budget table. There is nothing new in this sheet. So we've done macroeconomic framework on day one. On day aggregate supply, aggregate demand, inflation, monetary policy, fiscal policy in 3 days. Okay. Is there anything else? Good. Okay. Then I'll see you on Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Try and get some rest, get some sleep, have some fun.